The zip tie bit into Sergeant Major Calvin O.C. Drummond's wrists before he even had a chance to say his name. Not the handcuffs, the zip tie, the kind they use when they want to make a point. He was 61 years old. He had served 34 years in the United States Army. He had coordinated supply corridors in Fallujah, managed humanitarian airlifts out of Port-au-Prince after the earthquake, and once talked a suicidal private off a communications tower at 3 in the morning in South Korea, barefoot, in December. And now he was on his knees, on the gravel driveway of his own daughter's home in Clover Ridge, Tennessee, with his arms wrenched behind his back, and a knee that wasn't his pressed between his shoulder blades. The sun was going down behind the tree line. A neighbor's sprinkler ticked in the distance. Someone nearby was grilling. "Sir, please stop resisting," the officer said. Calvin O.C. Drummond was not resisting. He had not been resisting. He had been unloading grocery bags from the trunk of a rental car. He had flown in from Fort Bragg that morning, a surprise visit for his daughter Paulette's birthday. She didn't know he was coming. He had coordinated it with her husband, Derek, who had picked up the cake and the balloons and then conveniently disappeared to take the kids to the park so Calvin could get the house ready before Paulette came home from work. Calvin had the spare key. He had groceries in 3 bags: ribeye steaks, sweet corn, her favorite peach cobbler mix, and a bottle of Remy Martin that he definitely wasn't supposed to be drinking given his blood pressure, but had brought anyway because it was her birthday and some things matter more than the cardiologist. He had just set the second bag on the trunk lid when the cruiser pulled up. Not fast, not with lights, just pulled up slow along the curb, the way a cat approaches something it's not yet decided to eat. The officer who stepped out was young, maybe 28, with the kind of confidence that gets assembled in the mirror rather than earned in the field. He had a name tag that said Rutherford. He walked with his thumbs hooked in his belt and his eyes already decided. "Hey, can I ask what you're doing here?" Calvin set down the 3rd bag. He looked at the house, the key still in the front door where he'd left it, then looked back at the officer. "Unloading groceries. This is my daughter's house." Rutherford looked at the rental car, then at Calvin, then at the groceries, then back at Calvin, in that particular sequence that communicates a judgment without committing it to words. "You got ID?" "In my jacket." Calvin moved his right hand toward his breast pocket. "Whoa, hey." Rutherford's hand dropped to his hip, slowly. Calvin moved slowly. He had been moving slowly his entire life, in certain contexts, because he had learned very young and very thoroughly what happened when black men in America moved at any other speed. He produced his wallet and held it out. Rutherford didn't take it. He looked at the license through Calvin's fingers. "This says Fort Bragg." "That's correct. Long way from home. My daughter lives here. Her birthday's today." A second cruiser appeared from the opposite direction. The officer who stepped out was older, heavy-set, with the look of a man who had peaked at 35 and had been consolidating ever since. His name tag said Demarest. He walked up and stood slightly behind Rutherford, in a way that was meant to look casual and didn't. "What we got?" Demarest asked. Not to Calvin, to Rutherford. Possible B&E neighbor called it in, said she didn't recognize the vehicle. Calvin turned to look at the neighboring house. A curtain moved. He turned back. "There's a key in the front door," he said. "I have my daughter's spare. If you'd like to call her." "We'd like you to step away from the vehicle," Demarest said. "I'm putting groceries away." "Sir." Something changed in Demarest's voice. The word became a warning. "Step away from the vehicle." Calvin O.C. Drummond had commanded units. He had been in rooms where real authority lived, where it smelled like jet fuel and institutional coffee, and the particular silence before a decision that couldn't be walked back. He knew the difference between authority and its cheap imitation. What was standing in front of him on this driveway was the imitation. But he stepped away from the vehicle because 34 years had also taught him that being right and staying alive were not always the same project. He moved toward the grass strip between the driveway and the walkway. His hands were visible. He kept them at his sides and then raised them slightly, palms out, because that was the protocol, and he knew the protocol cold and had taught it to younger men who were afraid, and he applied it now to himself. "There's a gym bag in the back seat," Rutherford said to Demarest, peering through the window. "And what looks like, is that a uniform?" Calvin's dress uniform was hanging in a garment bag in the back seat. He always traveled with it. Old habit. He had a reception at Bragg in 2 days. "That's my service uniform," Calvin said. Rutherford turned. Why do you have a military uniform in a rental car? Because I'm in the military. That right? Damaris moved toward the car. We're going to need to take a look in there. You don't have consent to search the vehicle. Damaris looked at him. Probable cause. Possible B&E. Possible stolen vehicle. Possible. The car is rented in my name. My identification is in my hand and I have shown it to your colleague. The key to this residence is on my person, left there buying dues on my daughter, whose name is on the lease, which I am happy to call her and confirm. There is no probable cause. The speech was calm. He had not raised his voice. He had not gestured. He had simply said the words the way a man says words when he knows them to be true, and has long since given up, hoping that their truth would be sufficient. Damaris looked at Rutherford. Something passed between them that Calvin recognized too, another kind of language. Turn around, Damaris said. Hands behind your back. Officer, this is unnecessary. Turn around. The zip tie came out of a pouch on Damaris' belt. Not the handcuffs, the zip tie. And that was how Calvin O.C. Drummond, Sergeant Major, United States Army, retired, ended up on his knees on his daughter's gravel driveway, with a peach cobbler mix from the grocery bag, slowly rolling toward the storm drain. They sat him in the back of Rutherford's cruiser while they searched the rental car, which they did with the thoroughness of men who believed they would find something, and the determination not to leave until the belief was satisfied. They went through the gym bag. They unzipped the garment bag. They held up the dress uniform jacket and turned it over in the orange evening light. Rutherford squinted at the insignia. He turned to Damaris. What are these? Damaris studied the shoulder boards, the chevrons, the rocker, the star. He shrugged. Fancy costume, maybe. In the back seat of the cruiser, Calvin heard this through the window he had asked to have cracked because the heat was serious and he was 61 with the blood pressure situation. He heard it and closed his eyes and breathed through his nose the way his doctor had shown him and the way, incidentally, he had once demonstrated to a young specialist in a forward operating base in Iraq who was hyperventilating before a convoy departure. He thought about Paulette coming home to this, to the cruiser in the driveway, to her groceries scattered, to her father zip-tied in the back of a car on her birthday. He thought about Derek coming back with the kids, about his grandchildren seeing this. He thought about the 34 years, and then he stopped thinking, because thinking in certain directions was not useful here. I need to make a phone call, he said through the window. You'll make a call when we get to the station, Rutherford said without looking up from the uniform jacket. I have a medical condition. I need my phone. Rutherford looked up at that. He looked at Calvin, really looked, maybe for the first time, at the age, at the posture, at whatever it is in a man's face after 3 decades of being responsible for other people's lives. He reached into the property bag they'd placed on the hood, produced Calvin's phone and passed it through the window. Speaker, he said. Calvin did not argue about the speaker. He dialed a number from memory. It rang twice. Drummond. A woman's voice, clipped and warm at the same time. I was just about to call you. Where are you? Derek said. You flew in this morning. Paulette, Calvin said, keeping his voice steady. I need you to call Sergeant Major Briggs at Bragg, and then I need you to call your landlord and have them confirm to the officers on scene at your home that I have permission to be here. I'm in the back of a police cruiser in your driveway. Silence. Say that again, Daddy. He said it again. The silence that followed was a different kind. He knew his daughter. He had watched her grow up doing that same thing, going quiet for exactly 2 seconds before she decided to take a hill. Put one of them on the phone, Paulette said. Calvin held the phone out the window toward Rutherford. She'd like to speak with you. Rutherford took the phone. He identified himself. He began to explain the situation. He got approximately 4 sentences in before his expression shifted. He handed the phone to Damaris. Damaris' expression shifted faster. What they did not know, what Rutherford had not bothered to consider, and Damaris had not bothered to ask, was that Paulette O.C. Drummond was not simply a woman whose father had shown up with peach cobbler and a garment bag. Paulette was a JAG Corps Lieutenant Colonel. She was, at that moment, 45 minutes away, returning from a legal workshop she had been teaching at Vanderbilt Law School on military justice reform and the constitutional rights of service members during civilian police encounters. She had notes in her bag, literally, about this. She had a PowerPoint. She also had the direct line to the post commander at Fort Campbell, who had the direct line to the Tennessee National Guard. adjutant general. And she began making those calls military Vanderbilts from the parking lot of Vanderbilt, with her jacket still on and her workshop handouts still in her other hand, while driving, which she absolutely should not have been doing, but was because her father was in a zip tie in her driveway. She also called Derek. Derek called his brother Marcus, who was a civil rights attorney in Nashville, and had, in Paulette's words, been waiting his whole career for a case this clean. Demarest handed the phone back through the window. His voice, when he spoke to Rutherford, had dropped about 15 degrees. She says she's on her way. She says she's a lieutenant colonel in JAG. Rutherford looked at the uniform jacket still in his hand. He looked at the insignia again, the chevrons, the rocker, the star. He was beginning to, perhaps for the first time that evening, consider the possibility that the object in his hand was not a fancy costume. "Cut him loose," Demarest said. Rutherford produced a knife. He leaned into the cruiser and cut the zip tie. Calvin said nothing. He rubbed his wrists where the plastic had bitten. There were marks. There would be photographs of those marks within the hour, taken by Marcus's paralegal, who had also been called and was already driving. Calvin stepped out of the cruiser. He stood in his daughter's driveway in the darkening Tennessee evening. He picked up the grocery bag nearest to him. He walked to the front door, retrieved the key from the lock, and went inside. He put the steaks in the refrigerator. He set the cobbler mix on the counter. He set the Remy Martin next to it. He washed his hands at the kitchen sink and looked out the window at the two officers standing by their cruisers, neither of them speaking, both of them beginning to understand the shape of what had just happened. Paulette arrived 22 minutes later. She did not park in the driveway. She parked on the curb, door swinging open before the engine was fully off, and she was in uniform, not because she had planned it, but because she had changed for the Vanderbilt event and had not changed back. The oak leaf clusters on her shoulder boards caught the porch light. She walked past Demarest without looking at him. She walked past Rutherford without looking at him. She went inside and found her father at the kitchen table with a glass of water, sitting very straight the way he always sat. The way he had sat at every kitchen table in every house they had lived in, when she was growing up, all 6 of them across 4 states, following the postings. She sat across from him. She looked at his wrists. She said very quietly, "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," he said. "That's not what I asked." He looked at her for a moment. "My shoulder, when they brought me down." She nodded. She was already composing, internally, the structure of what came next. She was a JAG officer. This is what JAG officers did. They took the facts, and they built a structure around them until the facts could not be argued with. Marcus arrived 8 minutes later with his paralegal. The paralegal photographed everything. The wrist marks, the gravel where Calvin had been kneeled, the garment bag still lying open on the hood of the rental car. Marcus walked the perimeter with the quiet professionalism of someone who had been waiting for a case this clean and was not going to waste it. He spoke to Rutherford for exactly 3 minutes. He spoke to Demarest for 2. He did not raise his voice either time. He handed each of them a business card and told them they would be receiving formal notification of intent to file within 72 hours. Chief Warren Coble arrived at 8:47 p.m. He had been called by Demarest and had driven over in his personal vehicle, which was a bad sign for Demarest, because chiefs who drive their personal vehicles to scenes at night are chiefs who are trying to control the narrative before the morning. Coble was 60, a trim man with a grey mustache and the careful eyes of someone who had spent a career reading rooms. He read this one quickly. He saw Paulette's rank, he saw Marcus's card, he saw the paralegal photographing the garment bag. He saw the peach cobbler mix on the rental car hood where it had rolled and been forgotten. He went inside and spoke to Calvin directly, which was the right instinct, too late. "Sergeant Major," Coble said, "I want to offer my personal apology for—" "Chief," Calvin said, not unkindly, "your officers told me the uniform in my garment bag was a fancy costume. I'd like you to be specific about what you're apologizing for." Coble was quiet for a moment. "All of it," he said finally. "That's a start," Calvin said. "My daughter will handle the rest." She did. Paulette O.C. Drummond filed a civil rights complaint with the Department of Justice within 72 hours. She filed with the Tennessee Human Rights Commission the following week. Marcus filed the civil suit in federal court the week after that. The investigation that followed was not quiet. The Clover Ridge Police Department had a history with that street. 3 prior incidents in 18 months involving black homeowners and renters being stopped, questioned, or detained on the basis of calls from the same cluster of neighboring addresses. The pattern was in the records. It had simply never been compiled. The JAG complaint triggered a secondary review of how local departments in the region were handling calls involving military personnel and their families. 3 other incidents surfaced. 2 of them involved veterans. At the federal level, Paulette testified before a subcommittee. She wore her dress blues. She brought the photographs of her father's wrists. She brought the recording of Rutherford saying, "Fancy costume," about the uniform of a man who had served longer than Rutherford had been alive. The subcommittee room was quiet during that part. Officer Rutherford was terminated within 60 days of the incident, following the completion of the internal affairs investigation, which found that he had failed to conduct basic identification, verification before initiating a detention, had used a restraint method disproportionate to the presented situation, and had made statements demonstrating a fundamental failure to follow department policy on contact with military personnel. Demarest received a formal reprimand, a suspension without pay, and a mandatory retraining assignment. He retired 8 months later. Chief Kobler retained his position, but the department was placed under a consent decree, requiring the implementation of new protocols, external review of all detentions involving minority residents, and mandatory quarterly reporting to the State Oversight Board. The neighbor who had made the call, who had watched Calvin unload grocery bags from a rental car for 4 minutes before picking up the phone, was not charged with anything, because watching your neighbor and calling the police is not a crime, even when it is a harm. But her name was in the public record. The community knew. Calvin O.C. Drummond did not attend the subcommittee hearing. He was back at Fort Bragg by then, back to the work, which was the work he had always done. He read about it in the summary Paulette sent him. He called her afterward. "You looked sharp," he said. He had watched the C-SPAN clip on his laptop in his office with the door closed. "You would have been sharper," she said. "No," he said. "This was yours. You knew what to do with it." There was a pause. "Your shoulder still bothering you?" "It's fine, Daddy. It's manageable," he said. He had started physical therapy the week before. The rotator cuff had taken a strain when Demarest brought him down onto the gravel. It wasn't a tear. It was the kind of injury that heals, slowly, and reminds you of itself when the weather changes. 6 months after the driveway, on a Saturday in March, Paulette's family had a birthday dinner, the one they had been unable to have in October. Derek made the ribeyes this time. The kids ran through the house too loudly, and nobody told them to stop. The peach cobbler was from scratch, not the mix, because Paulette had found a recipe she wanted to try. Calvin sat at the head of the table and watched his family move around each other in the particular choreography of people who are comfortable together. He had his glass of water. He was not having the Remy Martin because of the blood pressure situation, and because some things, it turns out, matter more than the moment. After dinner, when the kids were in front of the television and Derek was washing up, Paulette sat beside him at the table. "Marcus says the settlement offer came in," she said. Calvin nodded. He had heard. "It's significant," she said. "Good," he said. "Give most of it to the fund." She looked at him. He had already been thinking about the foundation. "A small thing," he said. "Just a thing to help veterans' families when they ran into trouble navigating civilian systems that didn't know how to see them. It didn't need to be big. It just needed to exist." "You know what bothers me most," he said after a moment. "Tell me." "The uniform." He was quiet for a second. 34 years. Every posting, every deployment, every time I put that thing on, you know what it means, what it's supposed to mean. And that young man looked at it, and his first thought was costume. Paulette didn't say anything. "He wasn't evil," Calvin said. "That's the thing. He had never been taught to look, and nobody around him ever made him. That's what the consent decree is for," Paulette said. "And the reporting, and the testimony, I know." He looked at the table for a moment, then at her. "I just want the next one. The next old man unloading groceries, who doesn't have a JAG daughter and a lawyer nephew. I want there to be a different outcome for him." "There will be," she said. "We're going to make sure there will be." He looked at her, at this woman who had once been a small child falling asleep in the back seat of a government-issue sedan while he drove through the night to the next posting, and felt the particular weight of time and of being against all odds. Proud. "Happy birthday," he said. "Late," she smiled. "You were always late to everything. I was always where I needed to be. Officer, Rutherford, in the months after his termination, gave one interview to a local journalist who had been covering the story. He said that he had made assumptions he shouldn't have made. He said he wished he had looked harder. He said the word costume had been careless, and that he understood now what it cost. The journalist asked him if he regretted the zip tie. He said yes. The journalist asked him what he would do differently. He said, "I would have looked at the key in the door. It had been there the whole time, right in front of him. A key in a door, which is what a man looks like when he belongs somewhere." He had simply decided, before he arrived, what he was going to see. That is the thing about assumptions. They don't just fail the people they're aimed at. They fail the person making them. They close the eyes before the scene has had a chance to speak. Calvin O.C. Drummond drove back to Fort Bragg. On a Sunday morning in early November, the garment bag hung carefully in the back seat of a new rental car. The leaves on the interstate were brown and gold and letting go. He had his coffee in the cup holder and a missed call from his cardiologist and a voicemail from Paulette, reminding him about the physical therapy appointment he was already aware of. He drove at exactly the speed limit. Precision, still after all this time, a habit rather than a choice. If you've ever felt invisible in the place where you belong, if you've ever watched someone decide what you were before you opened your mouth, you know what Calvin carried on that driveway. And if this story moved you, if it reminded you that dignity is not something anyone has the right to zip tie and put in the back of a cruiser, share it with someone who needs to see it. Subscribe to Echoes of Justice, because these stories aren't finished, and neither is the work.